All right. Real quick, who all here is for the writing action scenes? Okay, sorry. What you're going to get instead is some ad-lib BS about magic systems. I hope that's okay. So with that, I guess I will launch into who I am, what I talk about, and we'll kind of do a rough poll, figure out what we want to talk about. So real quick, for those of you who don't know, I am c.r.rowenson, also known as the Magic Engineer. No, I'll be good. I'll be good, yeah. So yeah, I'm c.r.rowenson, also known as the Magic Engineer, and I am, real quick, I am a award-winning writer, a writing coach, a developmental editor, and on top of all of that, a magic system nut job. So that's why we're going to get into the magic systems. And real quick, just so we're all on the same page, when I'm talking about magic systems, I am talking about anything in our stories that enables effects or abilities beyond our capability or understanding. It's a broad description on purpose because that includes your standard magic systems, your advanced tech, your creature of the week, your planetary phenomenon, your astrological phenomenon, any of those fantastical elements that we have in our story that take it just beyond normal into fiction, into fantasy. So with that in mind, that's what magic is to me. Now, from there, we've got a whole bunch of stuff we can talk about. I think the plan is at 3:45, I'm still going to be talking about making your magic matter, and I really didn't want to do that now so that people who were planning on 3:45 missed it. Didn't want to do that. So we have other stuff we can talk about. I guess we're going to do just some hands to see who here writes fantasy. Okay. Urban fantasy specifically. Horror. Couple of horror. Paranormal romance. Couple paranormal romance. Sci-fi. And lit RPG. Okay, we've got a little bit of everything. So, would you guys like to talk about how to build limitations for your magic system or how to test your magic system? I guess we'll just get some energy going and we'll just do the woo factor. So if you want limitations, go ahead and do woo, I guess. Okay. Who would like to talk about testing your magic system? Testing your magic system it is. Okay. Now, I talk about this a bit, I touch on this a little bit in all of my other presentations. But when we're building magic systems, we all go through certain stages. There's a certain number of stages to the process that we all go through, or at least we should all go through. One of them is testing. And what testing really focuses on is trying to make sure that the magic system doesn't scale or come into play in ways you didn't anticipate. That's really what it is about, making sure you understand what it can really do, how far it can go, and making sure that you're okay with that. So when it comes to testing, there's two major ways that you can really do it. Lit RPG has it a little easier on one of these, and then everybody else kind of has it the same on the other. So one is doing a very analytical, numerical analysis, really trying to get into actual stats and numbers, and looking at what those numbers would mean, how they're going to go, and where that's going to end up. The other one is just a matter of exploration, and that's something that we can all do. That's what-if analysis and extrapolation. So when you have your magic system, you want to, let me pull up my notes. I have some notes here. Thank you everybody for being patient. Because who saw me talk last year? Okay, so last year I got 24 hours notice. Today I did not. But that is okay. And it's not here. Okay, completely making it up as we go. So we'll start with the God factors. That's something I always talk about. These are the most common places that these are the most likely places for your system to break. I call them the God factors because the closer a character can get to achieving one of these statuses, the more likely it is you're going to have breakage in your world, in your plot, and potentially in your character arcs. So your God factors are omnipotence, ultimate power, and that can be anything from an unlimited well of power, unlimited degree of power. So if there's no scope on how strong I can make my effects, that's on omnipotence. If I can access all of the powers and do everything all of the time, there's no limits on what I can and can't do. This is something where this is very common when people are first starting out, and this isn't a dig against anybody. One of the places we often start is that we want our magic to only be limited by imagination. And that is really, really dangerous for your story. Because what you have said is that they have unlimited power, only limited by their mind. And we are writers. I think we know the crazy shit we can come up with. And I probably shouldn't be swearing, so I'm sorry about that. But we know, oh, I'm good? All right, yeah, we all know the crazy shit we can come up with. So just saying, yeah, these people can do absolutely anything they can dream of. Well, you better be ready to write a world of anarchy and chaos and monsters and destruction, as well as, people just turning into butterflies and rainbows coming out of nowhere. It's gonna be madness, all right? We're talking, oh man, we're talking about Cthulhu and who is it? The artist who does those really vibrant like pony and rainbow. We're talking about a mashup between those two. Yes, Lisa Frank. We're talking about a mashup between Lovecraft and Lisa Frank. All right, that's what you're gonna see in your world if it's just limited to imagination. So, so omnipotence, and that can come in any number of ways. If you're dealing with lit RPG, just one of the ways I like to think about it is I do game a lot. So especially if you're doing lit RPG, if you have an infinite mana bar, you just kind of broke the system, because you can just keep spamming your spells over and over and over again. Doesn't mean you can't make a system that can work that way. In fact, for those of you who are tabletop RPG fans, I highly recommend a system called Open Legend, which is open source, and you can get all the rules for free online, but it does something interesting where the magic works the same way as all of the other effects, and those are unlimited use. Because they did it that way, they made sure that the magic scales and acts just like all of the other physical skills and abilities. So they made that balance of, yes, it's unlimited use, but it's just as much unlimited use as swinging your sword. D&D doesn't have that, where you end up with spells that can literally disintegrate people, them and their gear, which is a tragedy for every player everywhere who has, done that accidentally. And if you just let them have that unlocked, you're gonna have a lot of boring fights. They're gonna use disintegration to, bore through the walls of your fortress, burn down the gate, destroy the nursery, all kinds of madness. So, omnipotence. The other one is omniscience, so all-knowing. If your characters can know all things at all times, where's your conflict? Again, these are warning signs. If you have a character who is omniscient, this isn't to say you can't have a story. It just means you need to be very careful. This is a potential breaking point, because if they know everything all at once and you're trying to do a mystery, you're gonna need to come up with reasons why they can't just solve the mystery like that. I mean, and this can be enhanced intelligence. This can be, to a certain extent, like eidetic memory starts to go along the lines of omniscience. Being able to read people's thoughts and memories and do things where, like psychometry, where they can pick up an object and look at what has happened around it. If that has no limit to it, that can start leading towards omniscience. And I think you guys can see how that can be dangerous. You can just figure out what the bad guy is doing, where they are, what their weakness is, when they're gonna go to the bathroom, and then shank them while they're most vulnerable. So you wanna be careful with that. After that, you have omnipresence. This is not something you see as frequently, but this is just the ability to be anywhere at any time, or being all places at all times. So that can take the form of unlimited teleportation. That can take the form of like spreaded consciousness. Hive minds run the risk of that at times, especially if it's to the extent where you're saying they are spread out through the entire atmosphere. Less common, but equally problematic. At least if you're doing that for your protagonists. All of these rules go out the window when you're dealing with your antagonist, because if you have an all-powerful antagonist, an all-knowing antagonist, or an omnipresent antagonist, you just made things incredibly difficult, and that is fascinating. And in fact, that's something that Brandon Sanderson does a lot. In the Mistborn trilogy, the Lord Ruler is all-powerful and immortal, and they want to kill him. And they've got to figure out how to deal with that. So an example that kind of hits all three is Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. And that is a really interesting case, and I think you could see how if they made him the main protagonist and he had a very concrete goal, it would be really boring. There's a reason that Watchmen goes through the perspective of all of these different heroes and paints the world as it is and ends up turning it so that Dr. Manhattan actually becomes the antagonist for the future of humanity. So they have something to rally against and start applying more process and control. And it's a very interesting way they manage it. The last God factor is unlimited wealth. If you can use your magic to generate infinite piles of wealth, you are effectively a god. If you don't believe me, just ask Tony Stark or Bruce Wayne. And if you're dealing with something in a game, if I have found a loop so that I can, I'll try not to do my plosives right into the mic, sorry about that. If you can generate infinite wealth, that's gonna rob a lot of the tension and a lot of the play from the game. Because a lot of it is, you go out, you get gold so you can buy better gear, you can defeat better monsters, get more gear, get more gold, and etc. Who hasn't played Skyrim? Really? Okay, I thought that was gonna be like one person. Okay. Well, then this will make a little less sense. Sure, that's close enough. But you guys are all aware of Skyrim, yes? No, okay. All right, moving on. World of Warcraft. Who has not heard of World of Warcraft? Okay, cool. We're on solid ground. Correct. So with World of Warcraft, there's large, complicated game mechanics for the auction halls between the players, which if you, as a level 1 character, found a quirk so that you could generate infinite wealth, you could then buy items that were won by characters raiding, doing a level 80 or higher raid. Sounds like a problem. So again, the god factors you have to deal with are omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and ultimate wealth. Okay, so now that we know that those are the problems, we can talk about how to actually test for them. So the one way, like I said, is just conceptual and experimental. And for that, you need to take the pieces of your magic system and see how far you can take them. And depending on whether you are doing a more rational magic system or an irrational magic system, which I will talk about more later, but really, real quick, rational versus irrational is your ability to extrapolate. Mistborn and pretty much all of Brandon Sanderson's stuff is high on the rational side, because if he shows you they can do X, you can extrapolate saying, well, if they can do it this way, then in theory they could also do it this way, and you would be right. On the other hand, you have Harry Potter, where you only know the magic works because you have seen it work that way. The example I like to use is Expelliarmus, where they can use it to disarm their opponent from their wand. We don't know if it works with a knife, a book, or a gun. All we know is it works if they're holding a wand. and we can't assume that it works any other way because of how Harry Potter is written. So if you have a rational magic system, you really, really need to explore those lines and make sure that you are then building rules to block it. If you're doing irrational, you can just leave it as is and say, it doesn't do that because I said so. And people will accept that. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So, for example, it's a gross example, but I really like, I go dark with most of my stuff. So a while ago, before COVID, I made a virus-based magic system where the viruses were what was magical, and the more sick you were, the stronger your powers. So at your most powerful, you felt the most like crap, and I thought that was hilarious. So one of the powers was the ability to generate portals through infected blood, because I am a terrible person. So I took that basic concept of if I spill infected blood on a surface, I can now jump through that puddle out of another pool of blood. Basic idea. Then start exploring how far people can go. What is the range on it? How many puddles can they have at once? What happens when larger objects go through the puddle? If it just sits there, then if it's only a matter of size, then in theory, as long as I can fit something through the puddle, I can teleport it. So if I have something that's 1/2 meter across and I just stand the table on end, I can just drop it through. Or the way I ended up going is I didn't want it to be I wanted there to be some stronger limitations on that. I didn't want it to just be an infinite wormhole that you could feed as much stuff through as you wanted. Because you have a large amount of flexibility in terms of where you could put the blood. You could put a smear on the wall, you could leave puddles on the floor, you could do any number of things. So I didn't like that. So to put a limitation on the amount of mass, I decided that as objects passed through, they became coated in blood, and the size of the puddle would shrink corresponding to however much blood it took to coat the object. So as stuff would pass through, the puddle would shrink, and if it got too small, it would just cut off. So that was just me exploring the scale in terms of how much can go through. I started looking at other things such as how far away can they go. From there, again, because I wanted a highly rational magic system, I started looking at effectively the lifespan of bloodborne viruses. And using that as guidance, I ended up settling on something where it needed to be about a day is where it started losing efficacy, and the ratio of blood to mass would start to skew, just because that's the point where the virus would start dying if it wasn't in a host. And from there, I had a pretty interesting system until I was talking with my friend, and we're both terrible people. So we were trying to find workarounds, right, of how many puddles can I do? Can I store blood in the freezer and use that and thaw it out to make a much bigger portal? Can I get multiple people who are infected with this blood and make a much larger portal? Could I ship my blood across the country, have somebody spill a puddle there, I make a puddle here, and then I jump through it? So that is all the cognitive exploration and testing, seeing how far and how extreme we could make it. What was the smallest scale and what was the largest scale? And then we specifically started looking for ways to exploit it, because there the main problem is the amount of blood, right? So like I said, terrible people, we came up with the idea of, the question really, of what is to stop a bad guy from kidnapping a bunch of people, infecting them, and then repeatedly harvesting their blood to fuel their portals. I decided nothing, because that is potentially problematic, and it is potentially plot and system breaking. But I looked at it, and this is the other part. Anytime you find something that is a potential break, you can leave it because that stuff is interesting. It creates quirks and things for characters to find and for bad guys to take advantage of, and for your players and your readers to get excited about. It adds depth and nuance and new things for you to grow from. Because if there's this quirk and people don't understand why it's there, you have a whole area that you can explore just based off of that one thing. And in this case, while that could be potentially game and world breaking, I decided that if there is somebody who wanted to go to that much trouble to make a blood portal to drive a tank through, I was gonna let them. Because that was, well, again, I can't stress this enough, terrible people, and that was interesting. Now, if that's the sort of exploratory side, and before I move on to the other, does that make sense? Hopefully you guys are seeing how you could do that with your own magic system. Okay, good, lots of nods. It really is just sitting here saying, how big can I make it? How extreme can I make it? And as you put this is the other important part, as you add limitations, try and think of ways to screw yourself over. Try and find ways that you can bypass the limitation you just put in place. So I was working with my friend Abby, and we decided, okay, a day, how can they extend that? What happens if they freeze it? Well, if we freeze it, we decided that would rupture the blood cells, and therefore it would destroy everything. But if you refrigerated it and you had a blood bank, that could work, just efficacy would go down, just like it does with real blood. And part of that, again, highly rational. I was tying things heavily to the natures of reality. Whereas if I was doing irrational, I could have just said that these magic portals are effective for 1 minute, end of story. And if people are like, well, why just 1 minute? It doesn't matter. You're dealing with an irrational system. It doesn't have to have that extrapolation factor. Now, if we wanted to do a more mechanical analysis, that gets tricky, and again is more useful if you're doing more rational stuff. The 7 stages, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the 7 stages have gone through multiple iterations as I've worked with people, developed my own systems, and poked and prodded at what does and doesn't work. I used to have a stage because it started being built off of how I make magic systems. I used to have a stage that was specifically about finding equations and patterns. And I realized that most people don't want to deal with that. If you have that, though, so that was a big thing for me. So if I was dealing with a telekinetic, if we talk about steel pushers and iron pullers from Mistborn. So anybody who hasn't read Mistborn, the way they work is they would consume the related metal, so iron or steel. It would be in their stomach and act as a fuel source, which they would burn to then produce the magical effect. And while they were producing it, depending on which of the 2 metals they burned, they could either push metal objects directly away from themselves or directly towards themselves. And then Sanderson went on his whole thing with rationality, which he does, and it's why I love his stuff, adding in Newtonian physics of equal and opposite reaction. If I push or pull on an object that is heavier than me, I'm the one that moves. If I push or pull on an object that is lighter than me, it's the one that moves. And if you're somewhere in between, we might both move. And depending on the size, that will determine how fast I can accelerate it, right? So if you were doing some kind of telekinetic, you could start doing those equations of acceleration and inertia and momentum to figure out what stuff looks like. Because here's the thing, the power behind a bullet, or we'll start simple. Let's say you want the ability for them to throw an opponent across the room because it's cool, which, by the way, is always a valid reason for putting something in your magic system. Just saying. It can be just because it's cool, just make sure you explore the implications. So you want them to be able to throw them 20 feet across the room and into the wall so that they can get up later, shake it off, and stumble out the door, and you have diffused the situation without actually murdering anybody. A little boring, but okay. The issue there is if you start doing the mass acceleration and force calculations of what it would take to move a person who is 150 pounds and applied that to something the size of a penny, you can use the penny as bullets. So you took the exact same number and just scaled it down. And on the same way, if you scale it way up, what happens there? So this isn't really relevant, but that's where the equations and patterns can start to be really helpful, is you can then start to find the pieces to tweak and identify in order to make it work the way you want. Because I know all these numbers because this is for a magic system that I want to write with eventually. So I started digging into, well, what are these different factors that make this happen? would I need to change things if I wanted a character that could fire bullets but couldn't throw people across the room, or vice versa? I wanted somebody who could throw people across the room but couldn't fire bullets. When you have the equations and patterns, you can start looking at any of the individual pieces, which this is going a little bit off the rails from testing, but if anybody is looking to build something highly rational like Sanderson does, breaking things down into components and finding those distinct pieces is a great starting place. So when it came to telekinesis, right, I have force, I have acceleration, and I have mass speed. And that's really all I need to deal with. Because if my powers are limited so that no matter what I'm pushing, I can only push them up to a speed of 5 miles an hour, I'm not firing any bullets, and everybody's going to be okay. I can throw some rocks around, I can deal some damage that way. My strength may be high enough that I can throw people that hard, and that's going to cause some damage, but still no bullets. Same thing with acceleration. If you add it into, and you add in a range of influence, right? If I can only affect things 10 feet out, you can get into some complex calculus equations that you really don't have to deal with, but I only have a short period of time at which I can apply force and continue to accelerate things, therefore I have a max speed that I can achieve. But if you go with the max force route, it actually takes a fraction of the force to fire a bullet that it does to throw a person. So in that case, allowing me to max out speed and acceleration, but really limiting my force, I can really only do small projectiles. And those are the main ways for testing your magic system. And everybody works a little different. I often start with magic systems. A lot of my ideas and my inspirations for my stories and my characters and all of that kind of stuff comes from the magic systems that I create and the cool facets that I see to it. Not everybody works that way. You may need to write out your entire story before you can really get into your magic system. If you do, so if you have gone through your first draft, test it then. You don't have to have everything worked out initially. So our magic systems are exactly like our stories in every other facet, right? We don't go through a first draft expecting it to be a flawless story. You shouldn't go through developing your magic system expecting a perfect magic system with a single pass. So test it multiple times. When you're dealing with it, you're like, I kind of want this sort of stuff. Do some of the cognitive testing, the extrapolation, be like, well, okay, even if you're just writing down limits of no bullets, no kinetic bullets, don't like that. No Superman flying, I want something in between those. Then once you have written your story, really dig into the major plot points, especially anywhere that they are using the magic to solve problems, and test it more. And really expand on what you have there. Because that's where you can run into some issues. For example, with Harry Potter, you have the time turners, which is a really cool concept, that somebody can turn the hourglass back and actually go back in time for a minimized time loop, which worked great in that book, and this is where the irrational part came in. The thing is, if you extrapolate beyond that, why didn't they use it a lot of different ways? And why didn't other people use this to bypass problems? Or if so, what weird things might be happening where in one moment you thought reality was going to go one way, and then all of a sudden something interrupts and changes it. There's all kinds of implications to that didn't get explored. So make sure you explore those. And we have about 7 minutes, so I have pulled most of this out of my butt quite okay. I do have time for questions, but in general, that is how I go about testing magic systems, and when I'm working with people, that's how I help them test magic systems. So are there any questions? I know I'm not perfect. Come on, guys. Yes, I think we're recording, so that would be best. Yeah, and there's got to be more questions. I know I'm not perfect.
So, with testing magic, one of the things that I was really wondering about, because like I'm very much like you. Like my system, I built my magic, then built my world.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about? So with readers, there's a certain amount of suspension of disbelief, and with Brandon Sanderson's, you look at it, extrapolate, yada yada yada. So it's like, without going into exposition and killing the story, because your character's not necessarily going to know the limits of his own abilities, what he can and cannot do. And there's only so much limited experimentation you can show your character doing. So how do you imply those limitations without killing a entire chapter?
That is a great question. And you can kill an entire chapter, and you can do it without info dumping. And that is, I'm so glad you brought that up. Try fail cycles, which if you aren't familiar with those, you should be. Look them up. They are an incredible literary device to help take your plot and everything to the next level so that you don't have characters who are just always winning. So try fail cycles. They want to do something, they try, and they can't. So then they have to adapt and do something else. That is a really good way. So again, going back to the telekinetic, I may be strong enough to throw a person, and I've found a way to basically stun lock people in combat. You know, I pin them against the wall, I go up and I cut their throat. Boom, done. And then I come up against a big slavering monster, and I try it, and it scoots backwards, but I can't keep it pinned. You have now shown a limitation without having to explicitly say it. Now, depending on the type of character you have, that might not be enough for them. They may just take it at face value and be like, huh, that sucks, gotta find a different way. Or you may have somebody who, at extreme danger to themselves, will do massive amounts of experimentation to figure out exactly what their limits are. And that's actually a way that you can lead into furthering your plot. You can lead into enhancing your characters. You can use it to further develop the setting. You may end up, so for example, if you wanted some sort of anti-magic material, you could start introducing that where they have to piece together what it is they can actually affect. So like with allomancy, we know it's just metal, but if you did that in a sci-fi setting where everybody is initially wearing metal, they wouldn't necessarily pick up on that until they ran into somebody who wasn't. But yeah, next question.
My question is a more mundane one. What makes a lit RPG different from other types of fantasy?
Okay. I will answer that as best I can. There are also a lot of fantastic lit RPG authors here. So if you can and get a chance to talk to them, definitely do that. In general, lit RPG, game lit, and progression fantasy all sort of fall together. Progression fantasy in general, this is all my understanding, so if I'm wrong, guys, please don't crucify me. Progression fantasy is about clear stats and abilities that continue to develop over time. Lit RPG and game lit specifically has game mechanics on display within the system. So an example of that would be if I were to write my Skyrim campaign, a novelization, that would be lit RPG, where I'm talking about, I then crafted 200 daggers so that I could up my blacksmithing and make the greatsword that I actually wanted to. And I ran off, and I've been saving a perk point for exactly this situation. That's lit RPG.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you would be able to explain, like, limitations of powers of a character from, like, an example. I was wondering if I could give an example of, like, one of my own characters.
I would prefer to keep this to questions. If you want to talk with me after while we have the period in between, we can absolutely do that.
Okay.
So next question. Which, yes, by the way, there's going to be a half hour in between. We can keep going because we know who the next speaker is.
My question is, how do you deal with power creep, specifically with magic systems that are inherently highly lethal?
That were originally what?
That are inherently highly lethal, and you'll
Highly
have to...
lethal. Oh, God, that's a whole section about testing that I completely forgot to touch on. Thank you. Yes, so when you are doing the exploration stuff, there's a couple of key situations that I recommend you look at, and this is why I really wish I had my notes. Thank you. So looking at things of how easy is it to kill somebody is a great way to explore your system to see how broken it is. So just like he mentioned, if it's overly lethal, that could be extremely problematic. At least if you're trying to do any kind of standard fantasy or action story, that's a problem. Now, if your magic is extremely lethal and then you're trying to do a cute romance, that's still a problem. So exploring trying to kill something, how easy it is to defend yourself from damage of various types, explosions, guns, knives, fire, poison, all that kind of stuff, trying to find something, trying to escape something, and trying to, trying to get somewhere. Those are some great situations to explore.
Hi, you mentioned something about power progression. How would it still work, and it wouldn't be like a cheat or a bait and switch if there is already an established magic system, but then it starts changing due to characters like mutating? Or can I like draw it back and make it worth the advancement if there are like negative drawbacks
Yes.
to the magic they're using?
Yes. Okay, so for anybody who needs to go to your next thing or needs to go get food or anything, I have like 9 seconds left, but we can also just keep going, if that's okay. All right, well, I'm going to keep going. Anybody that needs to drift in and out, I won't be offended too much. It's fine. So with what you were asking, yes, you can absolutely change stuff. In fact, one of the big things about magic systems especially is that consistency is king. If you say it works one way over here, you want it to work the same way later, unless you don't. Very helpful, I know. But if you don't, so if it is inconsistent, that needs to be a big deal. So if it was this way and all of a sudden it's not, make note of it. So if that is part of the arc of the characters and the plot, of them mutating and things changing, that's fine because you're paying attention to it. The real issue is if you said, this will only work on metal, and then later they're doing it against wood and nobody says anything, you have a problem. But if they're like, this only works against metal, and then somebody succeeds to use the magic against wood, that has revolutionized how they understand their magic, and that needs to be a big deal. Make sense?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to develop like a rational system like that just appeals to me. And I've done all of my due diligence. I think that I have anyway. I've experimented, I've tested it. I've written a book or two in the series. I love it. And then all of a sudden I realized, bam, there's a big problem with my rational system that I never thought about or considered.
Okay.
And now I'm like, okay, this is kind of like an irrational system after all. What are some of the things that you can do to kind of like fix that? Like if you have already committed yourself to a system and you need to kind of like walk it back. I mean, I know there's some things creatively when you get into the book that you can do it,
Okay.
but how big of a problem can that be?
Well, you can always just change the system.
Okay.
So it could be that you could let somebody do it once, and then everything changes. Or people try to do it, and something's wrong. And this is an area where you can play with smoke and mirrors in terms of showing what you know, what the audience knows, and what the characters know. Because if you have built everything to be rational so far, and then there's this problem, and you say, well, you can't do that. The readers, if you've done a good job, will assume that there is some kind of rational explanation. In order to find that rational explanation, really what you want to do is, to a certain extent, throw out everything you have and go back through and write down everything you have shown. So really just look at what the readers have seen and what the readers have been told. More what they've seen, that's more important. And then rewrite your rules so it makes sense the way you want. Because it's fine if it was rational in a certain way, but their understanding was flawed.
Okay, yeah.
So
got it.
you can always kind of go back and be like, okay, I thought it worked this way. It can't. I have shown it doing this. So all of these things I have shown are true. I have come up with new rules that set the limitations I want and manage the things the way I want, and the characters just didn't understand it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. I think I'm going to step away from the mic. If anybody wants to come up and talk, we can absolutely do that. So thank you for everybody who did stick around. Again, I am C.R.Rowenson, and when you get out of here, whatever you do, keep writing and stay awesome.